Hi, it's Frank. Once again looking at the American folk song Take Me Out to the Ballgame. In my last video, I covered the chord progression, talked about the ways in which common progressions like 2-5-1, 1-6-2-5 turn up in this song, but they're subverted. That is to say, the expectation is to go from the 2 to the 5 to the 1, but instead you go to another chord, or in the case toward the end where we have a secondary dominant, which is a 5-5, instead of going to the 5, we go back to the tonic. Those small little subversions are what help this progression sound interesting and what help stretch out the actual tension that builds as the song moves from beginning to end. It's certainly not unique to this song, but it happened to be an easy song to look at that had just enough offering in it to make it interesting to analyze. Today what I want to do is take the next step with regard to chords, because we've talked a lot about them, of course, over many videos, and just start thinking about them as different objects. That is to say, instead of these stacked notes that occur as block chords, as pianists say, where there's a sort of stack note right there and then another one after it, we want to start thinking about them as notes, individual notes that move through time, melodically. In this way, pianists sometimes refer to it as a broken chord. And if it's a triad, or even if it's an arpeggio involving more than just the first 3 notes of the chord, it's the same idea. When we start to look at chords that way, and we start to listen to songs and then actually see what's going on under the hood, so to speak, you recognize that melodies are often derived, sometimes wholly, from triads, or at least whatever chords are being played at that moment. So we're going to see some of that in here. In fact, let's just dive right in and look at the first 8 measures. As we look at measures 1 and 2, we can find quite easily, and by the way, in the PDF link in the description, I've highlighted these triads in red just to make it easier to pop out. The tonic chord. And the tonic chord is used right from the first measure to the second, but it's used in first inversion, starting on G, going to D as in dog, and then arriving at B. The idea there is that it's being broken up by just one note, the note E. And that E note happens to be a step above D, one of the notes in the actual triad. It's also, of course, a note that's diatonic to this key. So really it's there to add a little bit of extra tension instead of just descending through that triad for the melody. The same thing then happens several measures later, in measures 5 and 6. Since it's basically a repeat of what we already played in the melody, that's why it appears exactly the same. So twice the tonic triad is used in the first 8 measures of this song, really helping establish that as the dominant sound, the home key. Moving to measures 9 through 16, we see that there are, in addition to the previously mentioned secondary dominants, 2 chords that come up which are diatonic to this key, the A minor and the D. That being the supertonic or 2 chord for the A minor and the dominant chord for D. In both cases, the triads are once again spelled out, this time in root position, but both times descending. In the case of the A minor, in measures 11 and 12, it's literally just all 3 notes with nothing in between. E, C, and A. When we get to the D as in dog chord at the end, we see the A go to F sharp, then we once again see an E inserted before we get to the tonic note of D. So the same note that was inserted on the first 8 measures is also inserted here to break up the D dominant triad. Here again, though, we see the same descending thing happening with the triads, even though they're in root position. So we don't have any triads on this line. Instead, we're actually emphasizing a movement away from it by using both the 2 chord and the 5 chord as triads. Moving to the third line of the song, starting in measure 17, we once again see, since the first 2 measures are a recap of the beginning, the dominant triad descending with that E stuck in there. Interestingly enough, though, as we move to the second half of this line, where the G chord reappears, we see that now the G chord is actually there ascending. It's moving from G to B to D, going upward. But in between each of those notes, we've stuck another note. The A is in there, and there's a C in there as well, which essentially means we're just playing the first 5 notes of the G major scale. And these are all ascending on their way toward the note E, which is the third of the coming chord, E, the subdominant chord C. All diatonic once again, so we're not pulling from outside this key at all. But what's interesting to note here is that we're just taking the basic elements of both the scale and the chords and commingling them. First 5 notes of the major scale mixed with the actual tonic triad, this time ascending order, G, B, D, starting with the root. On the last 8 measures of this, there are no whole or entire triads that are used. However, we can look at the melody and see it actually moves between a very small range. It literally moves from the G down a 5th to with one exception, and that's key. The exception is a C-sharp note, the only place in the entire song where we see a non-diatonic note used. Now we've talked about how secondary dominants always feature non-diatonic notes, and that's part of the allure of using them. It momentarily takes your ear away from an expectation that you're going to be in that key. Well, the same thing is happening here melodically with this C sharp note. Now it's used, it's worth mentioning, as a middle note between the same note. It's literally bookended by D as in dog, which of course is the dominant note in this key. Quick reminder, tonic, dominant is 5 notes away. In this case, that's D. So the C sharp is really just helping emphasize the dominant sound, and it's doing so at a moment when really what you're trying to do is make things sound as unstable as possible. And again, this is a folk song, so when I say unstable, it's all relative. What I mean to say really is that we're trying to make it so this is a return trip that's quickly coming to an end. So by emphasizing that D as in dog note, the dominant of the key, that's what's happening in the melodic, the melody of this song. So it's just happening melodically instead of just via the chords. Sure enough, right after that note is used, and after that measure is passed, and by the way, that measure features an E7 chord, we move to an A minor, and then a D7, and then G, which is the 2-5-1 we would expect to help wrap up the end of the song. At that point, we're also just seeing 3 notes. Beyond the tonic, there's just the submediate note of E, and then the leading tone, F sharp, going right to G. So it's a slow walk-up, we would say, as they're all dotted half notes that leads us right to tonic. But again, no arpeggios on that line in terms of whole triads. So in summation, then we see the tonic triad 4 times in this song in the actual melody, used melodically, one note after the other. In 3 of those cases, it's used the exact same way. In one, it changes direction. Instead of moving downward, it moves upward. The only other triads that appear entirely in this song are the A minor, which is the 2 chord, and the D chord, 5. And those triads are also used descending, but most importantly, they occur on a line where there's no use of the actual tonic triad, helping move your ear a little further away from where you started. Again, that first line featured the tonic triad twice in the melody, in addition to seeing the chord strummed 4 out of 8 measures. So heavily emphasized, we would say. These are all small little things, but they're worth noting because when they add up in totality, they make the song what the song is. And I'm by no means saying that this song, Take Me Out to the Ball Game, is the pinnacle of songwriting. Please don't mistake me. What I am saying is that there's small things that we can glean from this, which we can use either in our own creation of songs or in arranging of songs. And the truth of the matter is this song alone has been around for well over 100 years at this point. Some people like it, clearly, and it's been passed from generation to generation because it keeps getting played. So with that in mind, like I said, this is our first step toward looking at chord movement as a melodic, linear, I should say, left to right kind of motion if you're looking at music either on paper or on the screen. And we're going to get more familiar with that and start to notice that as it happens in conjunction with chords and chords progressions, where we're also using block chords to accompany the melody. So with that in mind, I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.